Hey, here we go.
How are you doing, Kristjan?
Cool. So we are now live. Just going to cue that up so it's a bit squarer. There we go. So how you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
Yeah, good. So obviously we've got a couple of minutes before the live event actually goes. Before we're meant to go live. So yeah, just obviously a good little chance for us to give a little intro, just for those of us who don't know us. So anyone new, my name's Kristjan. I've been an estate and letting agent for coming up 20 years, primarily in lettings. I've also been a tenant, still am a tenant of 22 years and counting. So yeah, pretty much seen everything there is to see on both sides of the letting journey. Paul, tell us a bit about you.
So oil industry background, engineering, worked on oil rigs, not the manly kind, small screwdrivers and notebooks. I did property since I was 18. So yeah, I've kind of done a bit of development and management and lettings, but I've been a tenant for many years as well. And owned a social living concept in southwest London called Caledonia. So I've seen all the kind of stresses that tenants go through, and we created a really cool concept to fix a lot of those problems. And then HMO Services London and now Yuno. So compliance is what we do.
Sexy.
That is sexy, isn't it, Chris? I'm trying to make it a little bit more fun. That's why we've got a cool name. I think it's a cool name.
Oh, that's good. So, okay, so it's 10:30. We're going to give it another minute or so just to see if we get a few more eyeballs on here. Just say, guys, anyone watching, do comment. We should be able to see your comments come up on my dashboard. Just be trying to get my screen off my glasses.
I thought you were trying to fix your hair there, Kristjan.
No. Why mess with perfection? But but no, my glasses. The one thing really annoys me having massive glasses. I just get a massive screen reflection.
But you look really cool though, so it's kind of like
there we go. Flattery will get you everywhere, Paul. So it's all good. all good. Cool. All right. So yeah, let's just start talking about this. So property licensing. Paul, talk to me. What is this property licensing thing?
What is it? Right from the kind of basics. Well, I mean, being Scottish, I've got to kind of take responsibility for this because it kind of started off because unfortunately there was a house fire in some student accommodation in Glasgow. Okay. Bars on the windows, etc., and a lot of the tenants died during that fire. I believe the property was over 3 stories, so they did a lot of kind of research around that time, and that's why they came in with the original kind of mandatory licensing before the change in October 2018. So 3 or more stories, 5 or more tenants from more than one household sharing facilities. That's how they kind of came out with it. And the research, they found that you were 16 times more likely to die in a house fire if it was over 3 stories, and 6 times more likely if you were just in a kind of HMO. So that's kind of where all the kind of regulation came from, and then it kind of fell out from there.
Cool. So you mentioned a HMO in there. Mm-hmm. Let's just flesh that out a little bit. What's a HMO?
Oh, it's a little bit complicated. There's several kinds of HMO, and the boring part of it goes from 254 to 260 in the Housing Act. But to really simplify it, you've got 254 and 257 HMOs. So a 254 HMO is 3 or more tenants from more than one household sharing facilities. So you could have 2 sisters and a friend living together in a beautiful flat, and all in the same tenancy agreement, and it could be a HMO.
And so HMOs, we're talking about houses in multiple occupancy, right? Yep. That's what HMO stands for. So obviously you've got that framework. Now I think what most landlords find confusing, baffling, is the fact that every borough is allowed to have their own framework to that licensing, right?
Yeah. So I think before we go into that, I don't know whether to confuse things at the moment of time, but let's just stick to the licensing part of it. The easiest way I explain it is you think of 3 things, right? You think of defining what a HMO is, Then you define whether you need licensing or not, and then you define whether you need planning or not, and it's all kind of three totally separate things. And that makes it a little bit easier to understand. And then you have to remember that when licensing is in effect, it could be most properties need a license are not a HMO.
Yeah,
they're family homes or one or two people, so it can be really, really confusing. And then, as you say, you've got this other layer of confusion that, you could be in one ward, one borough, and you cross over the street and you're in another borough and you have totally different rules. Really confusing. Yeah. And then you're within one borough, and the rules change from ward to ward or street to street. Or you could be at one side of the road and it doesn't licensing doesn't, you don't require licensing, but on the other side of the road you do. Pretty confusing. That's
why I think for landlords, right, it's super confusing. I mean, I think for agents, it definitely keeps us on our toes, but I think we're aware of the complexity and the variety of licensing schemes. But I think it's quite an easy mistake for a landlord to make, right? If they own a few properties, they look at one of their properties and they go, oh, no, that doesn't need a license. Great, I don't need to get license on any of my properties. But actually, no, every property is individual based on its location, based on the makeup of the structure of the property, the occupancy of the property.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. If you're in a flat and on the lower floor you've got a commercial property within the building, that could make it licensable. It changes all the time. On average, licensing changes every 9 days. So you could check today, but you might be fine. But tomorrow your house might not fine. You might need a license the next day, or you might plan the next day.
And so before we sort of go into deeper detail on this, so if you're a landlord who's watching this and they're like, do you know what? I don't know if I need a license. I've been renting for years. I've never had any problems. Never had an unhappy tenant. I'll just give it a miss. What are we sort of looking at? What are the repercussions for that?
Yeah. And firstly, it is a really common thing. I mean, I had a great woman on the phone today, Karen, and she's just really lovely, and she manages her own property. It's over the road from across the road from our own house. She manages it herself because it's so close. And she was like, I just didn't know anything about this. And she goes, I don't have a letting agent. I manage it myself, and where am I supposed to get the information? So yeah, it's a really common thing. So firstly, people don't know, and then, as you say, it's like if you do know, it's like, well, I don't want to give the council any money, I don't want to, etc. So yeah, I mean, I don't. It's really hard to talk about this without it sounding scary, because it is scary. It's
yeah.
I never want to kind of feel like it's some sort of big kind of scaremongering campaign, but like the council have got some amazing powers under this. It's not like, I mean, planning, they've got some powers, but licensing's unreal with the powers that the council have been given. They can fine you £30,000 per offence. So that could be, you could fall foul to multiple offences within one property, for example, some or escape routes or fire safety or room sizing or overpopulating the house, etc. So they've got those sort of powers. It can then, if you don't do what they say within a certain timeline, etc., and it's really confusing. The documents that they give you, are very threatening. They give you deadlines to do things, very short deadlines as well.
Yeah.
Here's a letter that, and in 14 days we need you to respond, or this will happen, and you're just sitting there, and it's really complicated because they address multiple parts of the Housing Act, which is law, and yeah, it's really scary for London.
Well, I mean, I found some interesting stats, and this is just for London only. This was extracted from the Mayor of London's report.
Yeah.
So in London so far, there've been over £5 million worth of landlord fines. The largest single landlord fine has been £100,000.
Yeah.
And this is in London. I think there's actually been some worse cases outside of London, actually. I think there's been some higher fines outside London. The highest fine on an agent, and that's the interesting thing as well, because, landlords need to beware. Don't just assume that because you've got a letting and or managing agent looking after your property, that they're on top of it. A good agent will be, right? A good agent will be, but landlords need to beware. They need to be on top of this. But But interesting, actually, the highest agent fine, higher, £167,000.
Yeah, that's still the top.
Serious money. But the average fine, I mean, to scale it down, like you said, we don't want to scaremonger people. To scale it down, the average fine is just shy of 4,500 quid.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
I think for most landlords, you're going to be looking at somewhere between 2 to 3 months rent in London.
And even scarier outside of London, you know.
And outside of London, exactly. You know, if you're looking
same powers and same everything with a £400 rent, you know, coming every month in some parts of the UK, and they can be facing the same legislation, you know.
Well, the average rent's about £850, isn't it? So you've got to be looking at that's for the average rental property, a £4.5 fine. That's 5 months. That's nearly half your year's revenue gone.
Yeah, exactly.
That's on a single offence, right? Like you said, you could have multiple offences. Now, also, I think I'm right in saying, I think my dog is about to try and disturb our live event by trying to get into my workroom. I can see her behind the door. Now, I think I'm right in saying as well, if you don't have the applicable property licence, you can't serve a legally valid notice.
Yes. So, it's a legally valid under Section 21, if that's even still a thing. You can't and which becomes a huge problem when you have and obviously, as you know, there's I don't know if the viewers know, there's the rent repayment order, so tenants can claim back up to 12 months worth of rent if you haven't licensed your property. There's a few other things that you can actually claim back a rent repayment order, but that's the most common, as in the tenants have figured out the landlord's not had a license, which becomes difficult. So basically, you could
end up doing a repayment, getting fines, and be stuck with a tenant that you no longer want in the property.
Exactly.
For whatever reason, whether you want to relet it, whether you want to address the issues with the property, whatever it is. If they don't want to leave, you're stuck. And you and I both know, Paul, submitting these license applications, the councils aren't quick, right?
They aren't, no. And in general terms, I mean, like, as long as you've applied, it usually comes down to like who acts first. So you get a lot of calls, we get a lot of questions around, you know, am I in trouble? What do I need to do? Etc. etc. If the council hasn't contacted you, if you make that first step and you say, I'm a good landlord, I would like to apply. And even most councils, if they kind of catch you, they've sent you a letter and says, and you've not overcrowded, you've not done X, Y, and Z. You know, you've just kind of been caught out that you didn't know the legislation. They'll give you a couple of weeks to kind of get on top of it before they start laying out the fines. You know, they will give you some time, but in general, it's about acting first. It's about not burying your head in the sand. Know that the council are in general reasonable people. If they're not reasonable people, then there are experts out there that you can get in contact with and take you on. I'll talk more about what an actual expert is in this case. Actually, let's talk about it just now. The key, you know, what we stand for is an expert is qualified, experienced, and accredited, and that's what's really important. I get called this licensing expert, and apart from it being a really cool title that I'm very proud of, I definitely am not an expert. Like, an expert is on average is always going to be better if they're qualified, experienced, and accredited. So in licensing, that's an environmental health officer, degree qualified environmental health, qualified and experienced in local council or private industry, and accredited by the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. That's what we do. That's what we stand for. And it's really simple. Don't take it. If you phone up your property manager, etc., there is some really great agents there that have got some great training, just like you guys. But on average, if you want to take some serious advice, take it from somebody that's actually accredited to give you advice, not even me.
But you need to be really alert, don't you? I mean, thanks for the compliment, but I mean, we're a super diligent lettings agency at our company, and you know, we try to be at the forefront of regulatory compliance and not just licensing everything. But you know, I've got to be honest, we've been called out a couple of times. We've got property. I mean, we cover a broad area, so again, we've got the challenge with London. You've got lots of small boroughs relatively close together, so even a relatively small portfolio like ours, you know, we can fall into 12 different boroughs with all their different licensing schemes. So, you know, when I say we've been caught out, luckily there was, you know, we weren't fined, we weren't slapped on the wrist, none of our landlords were punished, but there was a change. I think it was in the Tower Hamlets licensing laws. I think they brought out a new license we received nothing about it. No email, no letter in the post, no notification. It was really more. I think we went to their website just to look something up, and it was like, they've added a new license, and we quickly were like, right, got our management team on it, and literally within an hour, I'd sort of checked our portfolio. But I think we had 2 properties that should have had that applicable license.
I mean, you're lucky in London.
It was about 3 months old, and like I said, we consider ourselves diligent, right? This is what we do day in, day out, and I think that's the important thing is for any landlords watching this. Yes, this might be your job. This might be a serious part of your income, but for most landlords, this is not what you do 24/7. You don't wake up every morning and from the start of the day to the end of the day, you're not constantly assessing all your regulatory requirements, what's changed, what's new, what's not,
And I mean, just you mentioned there, check the council's website. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, in London, they're pretty hot on it, but I mean, the information on council's website is not always correct. I was on a council's website the other day, and it still referenced mandatory licensing over 3 floors in England. I'm like, why? It's changed. And I mean, even if so basically Hammersmith and Fulham came out the additional licensing scheme. Now, so the additional HMO licensing scheme was applicable to all 254 HMOs, as we discussed. And the really confusing one is a 257 HMO.
Right.
So that's a building of self-contained flats, but the building has to have been a converted building of self-contained flats, right? And it has to did not comply with building regulations and still does not comply, is the statement basically. So basically, if you don't have a building certificate, you've got a converted building, then it could be an S257 HMO. And basically, it's the other statement within it, which is a little bit harder to even then. It's less than 2/3 are owner occupied. So anyway, if you have a building of multiple flats that's been converted, have a look into that 257 HMO. And it's really important. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of things that come into this kind of regulatory stuff. It's like, if I don't need a license, I don't need anything. You do. You might still need a fire risk assessment. There's HSS that still applies. You've got the regulatory form or if it's applicable. You've got all these kind of other regulations. HMO Management Regulation 2006 for 254 HMOs. HMO Management Regulation 2007 for 257 HMOs. They're all things an absolute minefield. And the councils, when you phone them up or on their website, just aren't that helpful. I mean, Hammersmith and Fulham up until what was it, about 10 months ago? You phone them up and you ask them about a 257 HMO and that they license them, and they don't even know what it is. That's an interesting and worrying story, isn't it? I mean, we find that quite a lot. Calling a council. Yeah. Get the wrong advice. Get it in email. There's a lot of bad advice. I mean, I remember, I don't even remember what year it was, but I remember when they first brought out the HMO licensing in England. Yeah. And we were watching that obviously very closely because, as I've already said, we had lots of properties in lots of boroughs. I think at the time we had properties in 6 or 7 boroughs. Yeah. And I remember the deadline came into effect. There was virtually no information on any of the council websites. Yeah. And we set about calling every council. Now, this is a few years ago, so I'm not saying they're like this now, but we set about calling each of those 5 or 6 councils. And not on that. This was on the day the law started. So this was the day you could officially now be fined. Yeah. And not a single council knew what we were talking about. We called everyone. We were like, can we talk to the housing department? We need to talk to them about property licensing for HMOs. And, we'd get responses like, sorry, what? A HM what? So I think that was an early days insight into the mess that it is. As we touched on, staggering how slow the councils are processing applications. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to do a license application for a landlord and not receive that license for 6 months. Yeah, and to be honest, that's not remotely uncommon. Yeah, I mean, your risk for being fined for not applying is away once you've applied. You don't actually need to have the license, So that's as long as you've applied. Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Just to clear that up for landlords, that's a really good point, Paul. Once you submit your application, you're not
at the mercy of your local council. You have fulfilled your obligations having submitted that application, and until the council comes back and tells you otherwise, either you've passed or no, you need to address this or this, you are compliant.
So that's a really interesting point, because so I went to, it was a really fun open day about licensing at Camden Council, and they basically says apply for your license and everything's fine, you're compliant, etc., which is not really, you're compliant to one thing, which is you've applied for your license. And so it's and so Hammersmith and Fulham have got around. So there's loads of different. So yeah, you've applied for your license, you're no longer that. But what about all the other regulation? What about the fact that you're 16 more likely to die in a HMO, 16 times more likely? Your rules and regulations are still there under HSSRS. Maybe the RRO is in effect, etc., etc. It's not just like a one size fits all. It's fine. And then also, even if you just do what the council say when it comes to upgrades, you're still not. It still doesn't mean that you're absconded from all risk, basically, which is really frustrating. But it's
so, I mean, obviously we've talked about HMOs. I mean, you've got what is there? You've got mandatory, selective, and additional licensing schemes, don't you, in most boroughs? Depending on what they see fit. Now, I mean, something I find interesting as well. You've got some boroughs who do it by wards or certain patches, which are supposedly areas of poor housing that the council wants to target. Which I always find interesting, because if they know it's poor housing, they could already be enforcing that under existing housing laws and stuff. So I'm a little bit cynical about these licensing schemes. But I think what I've seen, which is interesting, and I find it a little bit worrying, but I suppose at least it makes it clear cut, is, you know, you've got an increasing number of councils now securing borough-wide licensing, right? So I think Newham was one of the first, if not the first, where literally every property, doesn't matter, HMO, one bed flat, bed sit, doesn't matter, everything needs a license. They recognized that they had a particularly severe issue with housing standards, and that's how they tackled it. I mean, I'm still a little bit ambiguous. I know a lot of landlords get very wound up about this, because I still question how effectively they're enforcing. They're proactively going out and seeking the rule breakers, seeking the landlords who haven't submitted the license, seeking the ones who are breaking the rules. No, I mean, like when you're talking when it's geographical, as you say, it's a little bit easier, and obviously when it's the whole borough, it's a little bit easier. Obviously, I mean, now that you have to apply to the government if you want to license more than 20% of your stock, basically. So I think it was Hillingdon. I can't remember. One of the councils has applied. We actually applied for the license because they said it was coming into effect, but they never got government approval for the scheme. So then they had to refund us the money, basically. So yeah, it's important to know that the government are clamping down on this kind of blanket licensing, which is good, but then also bad because it makes it more confusing. And I know some landlords have successfully overturned licensing schemes as well, isn't there? There's been a couple where sort of landlords have come together and sort of fought how fair the terms of the licensing scheme are.
Yeah, and that's around that kind of same process. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I had a really good point floating around in my head just then, and it has absolutely vanished. What I am going to say is we've got a few people watching. Guys, if you do have any questions, we can see your questions come up. We can share them. If you've got a good question about HMO, about licensing, please drop it in the comment section. Like I say, we should see it pop up here. And if it's a good one, we'll share it on screen and do our best to answer it. So, excuse me, do send us your questions if you've got them. So yeah, I've totally that fabulous point that I had queued up beautifully has absolutely abandoned me. There we go. It's popped back in. Brain does work effectively eventually. Something I also found really interesting with some of the property licensing schemes is that actually some of them will have requirements outside the overall government framework for regulation and compliance. So a good example of that is the electrical compliance laws, which in England and Wales come into effect on the 1st of July.
Yeah.
But we've got a couple of councils who, with their licensing scheme for a few years now, have mandated that those electrical checks need to be completed as part of their licensing scheme requirements, which I think is something really interesting. It goes to talk about, again, how messy and complex this is. The fact that, as you alluded to, you've got your property licensing laws. That alone doesn't make you completely compliant. You've still got all your compliance outside of that, gas safety, Legionnaires, carbon and smoke alarms, right to rent, etc., tenancy deposit schemes, all this sort of stuff. But I find it really interesting that, you could be not negligent, but you could be unaware of a licensing scheme that you need to comply with, but fully in the belief that your property is completely compliant. Yeah. Obviously, it's not by not having the license, but you might still then have to go another step outside of the standard government framework. It was quite interesting. We I can't remember which borough it was. I can't remember if it was Hackney or Tower Hamlets, or maybe it was both. But one of them definitely had that in there, and we sort of contested it with them. We tried to going back and saying that this is not a government requirement. The government doesn't mandate electrical checks yet. I mean, we already had a recommended process. We recommended our landlords did that every sort of 5 to 7 years anyway. I mean, very much in line with what the compliance laws are coming out as of 1st of July. But I just found it fascinating that, you had a borough who was mandating something which wasn't yet actually set in general law regarding tenancies. It's confusing, and what a really confusing one is when councils say you need to have all of these certificates satisfactory before you apply. So which means you get to, okay, I need a license, and then you say, okay, you need an electrical a fire alarm test, blah 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 blah. Measured floor plan with where all the kind of smoke detectors are, gas boiler, fuse board. That kind of get really complicated. So then you're like, okay, here's where my risk starts. I need to get all of these things. You then get an electrical installation condition report. It then fails, and then you're 3 weeks before you've actually got a new fuse board or up to standard for that point before you can even apply. I mean, you touched on something earlier as well, which I think is really interesting as well. Room sizes. Right. You can have a property which is exactly the way it was built whenever it was built. Whether that be post-war or or Victorian times or older. What I find fascinating is you can buy a property that could have been rented before. It might have been a family home. Who knows? You then go through this licensing process, and all of a sudden you can be told, well, actually, of your 8 bedrooms, those 3 don't meet the minimum size requirements. We had that, and we had a landlord that came to us, and they had applied themselves, and they got themselves in a bit of trouble, and then the council, they had a 3-bedroom flat, and the council shut down 2 of the bedrooms, and so we ended up with 1 bedroom. Slightly hampered your income.
Yeah, exactly. So so we had an unhappy agent and unhappy landlords who we had to fix all of that. We got them open back up. It's important to note that although you have the government minimum standards, you have your council's kind of minimum standards, and maybe they'll say it's 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., etc. They're pretty flexible, and at the end of the day, that falls into the grey area. You've got this kind of black and white, and you have this grey, and it's more about the kind of the holistic view of the kind of property itself. You have all these kind of hardened set fields. Your cupboards have to be 0.3 cubic meters per tenant. You have all these kind of, this is hard, and you see everything is black and white. Everything when you go onto this sort of thing is like black and white, black and white, black and white. And as you know, it's really hard to fight against black and white when you're dealing with the council. So it can be a little bit tricky. But you've got to look at the property as a whole itself. It has to be above the government minimum standards. But if you've got a room that's, say, a little bit below the local council's guidance, they're saying 8 and you've got 7.5 or something like that. It's not a hard and fast. They won't use it, because you have to look at, maybe it's got a nice big kitchen with a dining facility, maybe it's got a living room, maybe it's got other facilities that gives that room that extra space. And there's lots of things when you kind of look at amenities and layout and things that councils are really keen on. Don't be more than 1 floor away from your kitchen facilities, because they don't want people having to carry up hot plates, you know, and cups of tea over 2 floors. And that becomes more apparent when you think about, like, well, has the kitchen got anywhere to sit? Have they got a choice? And that's what changes bedroom sizes. And that's where you start looking at like bedroom sizes of like 9 and 10 meters square. And the council are saying that because they know that people are trying to cram so many bedrooms in and put a little galley kitchen in. And then that's where they need to think about that sort of thing. But if you've got a lovely kitchen diner, maybe a living room as well, they're going to be a little bit easier on you with room sizing.
Cool. So, Paul, believe it or not, we've pretty much flown through our half hour. We're into the last couple of minutes. So, yeah, I warned you. I told you half an hour goes quick.
Thank you very much.
Don't have problems chatting. So, I think, you know, what I think is really nice to do is to try and give landlords like a bit of help and a bit of advice sort of coming off the back of this. So, so what I'd say is, obviously, if you're a HMO landlord, you know, you can see Paul knows his stuff. Go on their website, check out Go Yuno. The company is actually Yuno, but the website is GoYuno. Is it .com or .co.uk, Paul?
.com, yep.
.com. So go on there, check them out. Obviously, just other things to think about. If you're not yet, whether you are or aren't using a letting or managing agent, talk to your agent. Don't assume that they are on top of this. I think that's the same of whether it's nationwide corporate or, you know, a 3-man band round the corner from you. I would just don't assume that they have been on top of this. So check in with them, check in to see if they have looked into this for you already and whether you qualify. Whatever they say, don't just take it at face value. As you've said, Paul, go to the council website, look at what it says on the council, try and understand what the requirements are and whether that applies to you. And I'd say that if you are using an agent and you find the council information confusing, you know, involve your agent in that conversation. Drop them an email and say, you know, here's the link to the licensing page. I'm a bit confused, you know, because of this point and this point. Do I need a license or not? You know, are you, you know, get something in writing, get confirmation on it. There's also some cool resources out there. Obviously, the NLA and RLA have recently joined forces. So if to become the NRLA, imaginatively. So if you're a landlord watching this and you're not a member of the NRLA, do check them out. Having merged, that is the largest single landlord body. You'll find lots of helpful resources in there, lots of help, tips, advice. They also have legal support that you can call in and get help on. So well worth checking them out. Interesting as well, the NRLA have a partnership with another very cool company called Camma Data, which used to be called Get Renter. And they are sort of like a property, very purely a property licensing sort of data platform. So again, I don't think Camma actually facilitate the actual application, but they just help you identify if your property needs something. So that's Camma, K-A-M-M for mother, A, data. And they've got some very cool data sets. And I think they've got a partnership with the NRLA. So I think landlords, I believe I'm right in saying landlords with portfolios of up to 16 properties, which is going to be, bearing in mind the average landlord has 2, that is going to be probably 90% of the marketplace. They have an arrangement with Camma where you can go in and check licensing on there. So that's a nice clean dashboard that just makes it easier to identify things. So yeah, just it's don't assume, right, Paul? I think it's, you know, be absolutely certain, you know, as with pretty much all regulatory compliance, don't forget as a landlord, the buck stops with you. Having an agent involved, yes, they might get a slap on the wrist for being non-compliant as well as you. But with pretty much all laws, fundamentally, it falls on you to make sure that your property, you're the main beneficiary. You need to make sure that your property is compliant, not just, as we touched on, not just with the complex space of property licensing, but all the other regulatory matters outside of that. And that is constantly changing. And the government loves doing this interlinked legislation stuff. So as we touched on, if you're meant to have a property license and you don't, that can affect your ability to serve a legally valid Section 21 Same with a lot of the safety measures, actually. Same with your gas safety, your electrical cert. There are lots of things, your deposit registration. There are lots of things in there that if you're not careful, you've obviously got fines and things that you can get penalised for, but it can also seriously affect your ability to get your property back. So do check those out. What we'll try and do as well when we share the recording of this later, we'll try and drop some of these links into the comments below so people can easily find stuff. Do engage with our video. Do drop comments in even after we're live. We'll happily come back and respond to those as and when we can. But otherwise, Paul.
Thank you very much, Kristjan. Thank you.
All right, have a good one. I know you've got a busy day, but yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Maybe do another one again with you soon. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers, bye. Bye-bye.